8:15 now. This is a story that started to emerge yesterday, and this morning campaign groups representing surviving victims of the contaminated blood scandal say that a recommendation to pay each of them £100,000 in compensation is a major step forward towards an official admission of responsibility.
2,500 people were killed after being infected with lethal viruses in the 1970s and 80s. It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Laura Trent has more.
It was the scandal that infected tens of thousands of people and affected many thousands more. At least 2,400 people died after contracting HIV or hepatitis C in what's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The treatment was given to patients from the mid-1970s to 1991. Sue remembers her husband Steve as she visits his grave in Devon. He was infected with hepatitis C and died in 2018.
I had my earning power taken away from me. My husband had his earning power taken away from me. We lost our home, we lost everything we had. Why shouldn't I financially, because that's the only thing the government can now give me, have some part of what I lost?
The purpose of the independent public inquiry is to examine the circumstances in which patients treated by the NHS were given infected blood. The chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, said interim compensation payments of £100,000 should be made without delay, with more possible later.
I've decided to recommend that interim payments of no less than £100,000 are made to all the infected people and all the bereaved partners who are currently registered with the schemes.
Since the start of the inquiry in 2019, one person affected by the contamination has died every 4 days. Messages to lost loved ones have been left in bottles. The government says it will consider the judge's recommendations with the utmost urgency. It could be facing a compensation bill of billions of pounds. Laura Trent, BBC News.
We're joined now by the former Health Secretary and Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who's been speaking at the inquiry. Good morning, Andy. And Jason Evans, whose father, Jonathan, died as a result of infected blood in 1993. Good morning to you, Jason. Jason, can we start with you? You've been a campaigner for this for a long time now. Would you mind, as much as you are comfortable with, to tell us about what your father went through?
Sure. Well, my father was born with a genetic blood clotting disorder called Hemophilia, and like all haemophiliacs in the 70s and 80s, he began to be treated with this new pharmaceutical product called Factor 8. And unlike previous treatments, it was made by mixing or pooling together the blood plasma donations of tens of thousands of often paid donors overseas, and as a result he was infected with hepatitis C and HIV, and he died as a result of those infections when I was 4 years old in 1993. Now,
the compensation that has been recommended of at least £100,000 per person or for members of the family, how does that feel to you?
Well, that's not actually correct. So what was recommended yesterday was that £100,000 interim compensation should be made to living victims or the families of victims where they were in a relationship at the time of their death. And what that means is that now there's a terrible situation. I mean, the amounts of phone calls and messages I had yesterday from where now you have a situation where half of bereaved families it's suggested should get interim compensation and half shouldn't. And that's because, particularly for those infected with HIV, they were infected as children, and so they died as children, and so they didn't live long enough to form relationships. You also have families where either the widow or widower has since died, or the person's relationship broke down as a result of their infection. Those families, it's not being suggested, should receive any compensation at all at the moment. So, and that I have to say is not the fault of the inquiry's chairman, Sir Brian Langstaff. That is the fault of the government and the Department of Health, who have created a scheme that effectively excludes half of these bereaved families, in my opinion, and I'm sure Andy can speak to this, to minimise the financial exposure. And it creates a situation where some victims' lives matter at the moment and others don't.
And we will come to Andy in a moment. I just, to clarify this, you spoke about your dad, Jason. How did it affect the relationship he had with your mum? Because, as you said, it's about those families as well who are living with the memory of this.
Well, terribly. I mean, when he was told eventually, months after the hospital knew that he had been infected with HIV, through these products which were made by Bayer, Baxter, Revlon Healthcare and other companies, the stigma that he and my mother faced was terrible. My mum, who wasn't infected but was working in a bakery, was fired from her job, and the owner had it ran in the local press, the owner had no bones about saying that he had fired my mother because customers might be worried that they were being served by someone whose husband might develop AIDS. The stigma was terrible, and I also faced that, at school, being called the AIDS boy, and it was something that you always internalize and keep a secret, because it was one of those things that if people found out, God knows what would happen. But I think over the years, and as I got older, it got to a point where the government's resistance to accept that what happened was avoidable and to provide truth and justice to people, I think for me and for many people, became so overwhelming that you have to kind of disregard that and go public, if you like, even if you don't want to.
It's a heartbreaking testimony, Jason, that you've given. The government has said that it will consider Sir Brian's report and the recommendations of Sir Robert Francis QC with the utmost urgency and respond as soon as possible. Andy, what would you like to see in terms of the way this scheme eventually plays out, maybe compared with what initially is on the table?
Well, this certainly is a step towards the truth and justice that Jason just spoke about, Roger. But it's only a step, as Jason's very eloquently outlined. There's many people who are outside of this scheme, but nevertheless, it will help many people who are struggling right now. The really appalling statistic is about every 4 days somebody infected is dying, and that's why Sir Robert Francis made this recommendation, and it's why the chair of the inquiry has said that the government should now act with the utmost urgency. And I guess my message this morning is to the outgoing Prime Minister. Please, Prime Minister, do this today. Say you'll do it today. Nobody will disagree. Every single member of Parliament will support it. People have waited far, far too long. People affected in this way, harmed in this way, should not be in the position of still having to fight all these decades on.
And you wrote to when there were 5 contenders left in the Conservative leadership race. I think you wrote to them all. There's obviously only 2 left now. Have either of the remaining 2 responded to you?
Not that I'm aware. So I have written because I felt it was important that the incoming Prime Minister would also support this move. So I hope Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak would also show their support. The issue is this, Roger, and this goes back to the time even when I was a minister, and many people have been ministers. The government hasn't been truthful about this matter because of the fear of the financial exposure. So it's clung to a line for decades that nothing wrong was done, that they did everything they could have done, and it simply isn't true. It simply isn't true. As Jason said, the risks were known, and yet people were given these products anyway. I would even go so far as to say there may be a case for corporate manslaughter here. But those questions perhaps are for Sir Brian and for another day. Today is about giving people the support that they need now so that they can settle their financial affairs. Many have not got long left at all. So the case to act is overwhelming. There is full cross-party support for this. I would just ask the government, the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, deserves credit for setting up this inquiry, but the government now should follow through on that and act today.
You've just mentioned when you were Health Secretary, Andy, towards the end of the last Labour government, and you wrote to an infected person saying there was no evidence that individuals were knowingly infected with contaminated blood and blood products. But you just said that back then, even then, the government was not being truthful about it. So Were you not being truthful at that time?
That was what I was told by the Department of Health, Roger, and this is the issue. Many ministers were told exactly the same thing. It was a good friend of mine, the late Paul Goggins, who asked me to sit down at that time with people who had been affected. And that's when I began to uncover, as far as I understood it, the truth. And it wasn't as the Department of Health told me. And that is the issue. And I said that at the inquiry recently. I think Jeremy Hunt said something similar just this week. So the case, I'm afraid, is clear that the government was never truthful, even with ministers, because of the fear of financial exposure. And that leaves people today, decades on, damaged in the way that they have been in terms of their lives, still having to fight to get some form of truth and justice. It's just not right.
Jason, where do you go from here?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that this is a step forward, but what we have is a recommendation, and ultimately now the government needs to act. And I unfortunately think in order to get the government to act, from all of us, from politicians, lawyers, campaigners, victims, families, we are all going to need to continue to campaign, I fear, to get this over the line, to get Michael Ellis, the Paymaster General, to action this. I suspect someone in the Treasury needs to open the door and sign this off. And look, the government have been sat on Sir Robert Francis's compensation framework study for 6 months, and outwardly at least, nothing has happened. The last time Sir Brian Langstaff asked the government to do something, which was levelling up the support schemes, it took about 2 years, I think. So hopefully the government can do better this time.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and what is going on. Jason Evans there, who's a campaigner, and Andy Burnham, of course, Mayor of Greater Manchester and former Health Secretary, thank you as well. And I should say again, just a government spokesperson has said, we recognise how important this will be for people infected and affected across the UK, and can confirm the government will consider Sir Brian's report and the recommendations of Sir Robert Francis QC with the utmost urgency and will respond as soon as possible.